E-learning doesn't just happen. It requires careful planning and implementation. A very good afternoon to everyone present here. I am Harshita Khare, the moderator for today's session organized by Law Internships. Law Internships started by a few individuals from the field of law. Mr. Shubham Solanki sir, who is a co-founder and partner, and Ms. Amrita Jain ma'am, who is also a partner at Law Internships. It is set up with an objective of providing day-to-day experience of various legal bodies through legal internships to students pursuing undergraduate and postgraduate courses in the field of law. Today we have amongst us Mr. Harsh Pratap Singh sir, Assistant Professor, KLE Society's Law College, and he started his career from the School of Law, Christ University, Bangalore in the year 2013. Currently, he is working with KLE Society's Law College, holding various responsible positions at institutional level. Sir also presented in various national and international seminars and conferences. He was also invited as resource person and delegate on regular basis at various programs of academic enrichment. We welcome you, sir. Introducing today's topic briefly, today we are going to have a discussion on relevancy, admission, and the opinions of third person when relevant. Before we begin with the session, let me give you a few instructions. Kindly, as it is an interactive session, make sure that in case you have any questions, type it in the chat box or raise your hands. So when prompted by us, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Also, kindly mute your audio and turn on your video if possible. Without any further delay, let's begin with the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Harshita, for the introduction. So, I hope admissions and confessions, these two topics are clear to you. And today we will start with, another important topic under the chapter relevancy of fact, and that is dying declaration. So, Harshita, can you please project section 32 on screen?
Sure, sir.
Thank you so much. Okay, now, so we will start with dying declaration, which is a very important, relevant fact under the chapter relevancy of fact contained in section 32. Okay, now, first you need to understand that it is not the whole of section 32 which relates to dying declaration. Specifically, it is only section 32 subclause 1 which provides for dying declaration, correct? So what is the subject matter of section 32? Let us understand that first. What is section 32 dealing with, right? So section 32, if you quickly observe the heading of section, it says cases in which a statement of relevant fact by a person who is dead or cannot be found, etc. Right? So person who is dead or who cannot be found, etc. is relevant, correct? So first of all, you need to remember that section 32 does not only relate to dying declaration. It relates to basically the statements which are made either in a written form or in a verbal form in regards to a relevant fact, right? There is a statement which is made either in written form or in verbal form with regard to a fact, and it is made by whom? It is made by a person who is dead, or the person cannot be found, or the person who is incapable of giving evidence, or whose attendance cannot be procured by the court without reasonable amount of delay, correct? So, and the statement of such persons, right, may relate to different type of things. But if it relates to death, it is covered under section 32 subclause 1. Subclause 1 here is important. Correct? You see, section 32, what I'm trying to tell you is that section 32 does not only deal with dying declaration. Correct? It deals with various circumstances in which a statement has been made by a person who cannot be basically called to the court. Correct? So there are 5 circumstances in which a person cannot be called to the court. If a person is dead, can you call a dead man to the court to give testimony? The answer is no, because he is dead. You cannot call him as witness. A person who is absconding from the process of justice, who is not to be found, can you call such person to the court to give evidence, to give testimony? The answer is no, because he cannot be found. Similarly, a person who has become incapable of giving evidences, right? A person went lunatic. You cannot call a lunatic to the court to give evidence. He cannot be called. Similarly, a statement of a person who cannot be called to the court, because calling him to the court would be either unreasonable or it would amount lot of delay. It will cause lot of delay to the proceedings, or it will involve lot of expenses. There will be lot of expenses involved in calling him to the court. So there are these 5 categories of person who cannot be called to the court, right? The statement of these 5 categories of persons, the statement of these 5 categories of person can be in relation to various circumstances which is mentioned in subclause 1 to can you scroll down? How many subclauses are there? I guess 8 subclauses, right? So they may relate to any of the 8 clauses which are mentioned, which are attached to section 32. However, if the statement relates to the cause of death, if you can please focus on subclause 1, if the statement relates to cause of death, in such a case it is called dying declaration. Correct? Now I have told you that there are 5 cases, there are 5 situations in which a person cannot be called to the court, right? Now if a person is dead and if he has made a statement under the expectation of death, correct, if he has made his last statement under the expectation of death and his statement relates to the cause of his death, that why he died, right, or the statement relates to the transaction, circumstances of the transaction which resulted in his death, then his last statement is relevant as dying declaration. Correct? So dying declaration is what? It is the statement of a person who is dead and he has made that statement, disclosing the cause of his death, or there is something in that statement which relates to the circumstances in which death has been caused. In such a case, the statement is called dying declaration, right? So 2 essential ingredients of dying declaration are that the person making the statement should be dead and the statement relates to the cause of his death, or a statement relates to the circumstances in which the death has been caused. So if these 3 essential ingredients are satisfied, then we can say that the statement is dying declaration, right? Now, why is dying declaration relevant and why is dying declaration so important in Evidence Act? Correct? So why dying declaration is relevant and why is it so important? The reason for this is that dying declaration, I mean the dying declaration is made relevant upon the presumption that no man is going to meet his creator with a lie in his mouth. A person while on the deathbed will not lie. A person who is under the expectation of death will not lie, right? All the motives of speaking falsehood are silenced within him. Correct? However, this presumption is rebuttable. Some person may be, maybe thinking that, hum to doobenge sanam, to main bhi le doobenge. Right? Anyways, I am dying, so you will also not live a happy life. So somebody may implicate you, right? But that's not the presumption. The presumption is that he is not lying, right? However, a person may lie. A person may lie, but the presumption is in the favor of truthfulness of dying declaration. It is believed that the person will not lie on his deathbed, right? Now, here I will tell you, few quick differences between how dying declaration is treated in English law and how dying declaration is treated in Indian law. Right? There is a difference. Now we have our Indian Evidence Act shares a lot of common features, lot of commonality with the common law, the English law, right? Because this is drafted by an Englishman, Sir James William Stephen, right? So it takes various principles, it borrows various principles from common law. So what is the difference between dying declaration under English law and dying declaration under Indian law? This is what we are going to see. If you see, in English law, it is necessary that the person making dying declaration must be on his deathbed, right? I hope you can understand this point. In Indian law, in English law, it is necessary that the person who is making dying declaration, he must be on his deathbed. Deathbed means he must be under the expectation of death. He must have a foresight of death. He could see the death coming to him, right? When a person makes a statement under English law, if it is to be relevant as dying declaration, he should be under the expectation of death, right? However, in Indian law, that's not the case. You may not be in the expectation of your death. However, if you are dead already and the statement, your last statement relates to the cause of your death or circumstances of the transaction in which death has been caused, that statement is still admissible. Now you may ask me, sir, if I can, if I can substantiate it with an example. It's like this, right? I wrote in a diary, right? I have a personal diary. I wrote in the diary that, I am unable to pay. I have obtained loan from some Mr. X, and Mr. X is every day sending his goons to threaten me. I wrote in my diary that now the pains and sufferings which Mr. X is giving me for the reason that I cannot repay his loan are now unbearable. Correct? His goons will come and very often humiliate me. And it's better that, I should put end to my miseries. I should put end to my miseries. Correct? This is what I wrote. And I left this in my almirah. Correct? And after that, I am not found. Now here, when I'm making this statement, I'm not under a foresight of death. I'm not expecting immediate death, right? I wrote this statement and I left it in my almirah. And 15 days later, 1 month later, my dead body was found in some hotel. If police, while conducting search, finds this diary from the almirah and the last statement which I had made that Mr. X is, torturing me, his goons are humiliating me, and it's better to put end to the misery. This statement shows, something in relation to my death. It substantiates the cause of my death. What could have been the probable cause of my death? Probable cause of my death could have been the humiliation which I am suffering through the hands of Mr. X. Correct? So this statement, last statement, when I wrote this in my diary, I did not be under an immediate, expectation of death. However, this last statement, since I am already dead and the last statement written by me relates to the circumstances of the transaction in which death has been caused, it will be relevant as dying declaration. But in English law, person should be under the expectation of death, right? He should be on the death bed, right? That's not required in Indian law. Second important difference between English law and Indian law is that in Indian law, dying declaration is used in both type of cases, civil cases and criminal cases, right? Dying declaration is relevant in a civil case. Dying declaration is also relevant in a criminal case. In both the cases, dying declaration is relevant. However, in England, dying declaration is relevant only in criminal law, particularly in the cases of homicide. Otherwise, dying declaration is not relevant. Only if it is a case of homicide, then dying declaration is relevant, otherwise not. Correct? This is second important difference. And third important difference is that in Indian law, you can make dying declaration only for yourself. Correct? He can speak only for himself. I can make dying declaration only for myself. I cannot make dying declaration for others. But in Indian law, you can make dying declaration for
Excuse me, sir.
Is there some network issue?
Yes, sorry for the interruption. Sir will be joining soon.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Mr. Harsh.
Weather is bad in Bangalore, and there's a storm outside, and there has been a power failure. So I think the power resumes soon, or else we will continue as long as we can continue. So in dying declaration, I mean, for example,
Mr. Harsh, sorry to interrupt. I mean, when the network went off, you were on the third difference. A dying declaration can be made only for myself, whether it was in Indian or in England law.
hello. Yes. Thank you so much. I got it. So in Indian law, if a person dies, correct? I mean, for let's say myself, me and my wife both are assaulted by, by Mr. X, and my wife is dead, let's say, because of that assault, and I am on my deathbed. In my dying declaration, I can say that X is the one who has assaulted me as well as killed my wife. Correct? I can make dying declaration for my wife, and I can make dying. I mean, in both this statement will be relevant as dying declaration both for me as well as my wife. But in English law, the application of dying declaration, this is very strict. A person can only make a dying declaration for himself. Correct? You cannot speak about others. That's a relevant fact there, but it won't be treated as dying declaration. In English law, right, my statement that X was the one who has killed my wife and assaulted me, and I am on the deathbed. In English law, if I tell this, then my statement will be relevant in investigation, but it will be treated as dying declaration only for me, with respect to me. It won't be a dying declaration for the person who is already dead and for whom I am making a declaration before the court. Right? I hope this point is clear to you. Now, these are three important differences between dying declaration in Indian law and dying declaration in English law. Right? Why dying declaration is considered to be relevant, this I have already explained. Right? Now you see, there is no particular form in which dying declaration has to be made. If you go through section 32 subclause 1, it says when it relates to the cause of his death. I will read 32 subclause 1. It says, when the statement is made by a person as to the cause of his death or as to any circumstances of the transaction which resulted in his death, in a case in which the cause of the person's death comes into question. Right? Now, this is where the idea of dying declaration is contained. Now, you see that there is no particular form in which dying declaration can be made. This section nowhere, neither in clause 1 nor in rest of the clauses, provides for a particular form that dying declaration has to be recorded in a particular form. It does not say who has to make or who can make a dying declaration. Correct? Who can not who can make a dying declaration, rather who can record dying declaration. It has to be given to whom. On all these aspects, form and to whom it can be given, section 32 is completely silent. Right? Now, if you closely observe, so you must understand that there is no particular form in which dying declaration has to be recorded, or there is no particular person, or there is no list of persons to whom dying declaration can be given. Dying declaration can be given to any person, it can be recorded in any form. However, if you closely look at the opening words, of section 32, it says statements written or verbal. Right? It does not use the word oral. in Evidence Act, generally wherever the word written is used, in contradistinction they have also used the word oral. For example, admissions can be made orally or in writing, but here they have used the word verbal. They could have written the word oral. So the point is, what is the difference between oral and verbal? Is there anyone who would like to answer this question? I hope my question is clear. Generally, Evidence Act with written, they will write the word oral, written or oral. But Section 32 uses the word statements, written or verbal. Can anybody tell me why they have used the word verbal here instead of oral? What is the difference between oral and verbal?
May I try, Mr. Harsh?
Yes,
This is Advocate Raju Thakkar.
yes sir, please.
Okay, now I may not be right, but the difference that I feel when it comes to English law, since it is only for oneself, maybe oral may be used from that point of view. But when you gave the example of X and Y being assaulted, Y dying, and X giving the statement which is taken as a dying declaration, so that may be the difference perhaps, then when you can give the cause of death of the other person also when you are equally present there, but you are alive or you are dead, but that statement is recorded for both of them. Therefore, maybe verbal word is used instead of oral.
Sir,
I'm sorry, it was just I just tried to.
yes. All the answers are welcome, sir. All solutions are welcome. Answers are welcome.
Thank you.
Sir, but the real reason why they have used the word verbal here is this. The reason why they have used the word verbal here is that sometimes a person who is on the deathbed, let's say he's been assaulted brutally. Sir, can you please mute your mic for a while? Yes. Thank you so much, sir. Why the word verbal has been used? Let's say a person is brutally assaulted, correct? And he on the deathbed is not in a position to speak clearly, correct? That means he's trying to tell you that who has killed him, who has assaulted him. He's trying to tell you, but he's not able to speak properly, right? When he's trying to speak, the voice is not coming out clearly. So he's trying to speak. At the same time, he is also making certain gestures to communicate, to tell you, what has led to this situation, correct? So for such cases, it is not oral, because when he's trying to speak, nothing is coming out of his mouth, correct? However, he's trying to speak a bit. At the same time, he is making some gestures through which he's trying to tell you the things, right? And when these gestures are interpreted, correct, when they are recorded, now this type of declaration which is given in these situations, in this form, to cover this, they have used the word verbal here, correct? For example, sir, there was a case in which there was a prostitute, right? It's an old case, sir. In 17th century, Queen versus Abdullah. I don't remember the exact citation, but it's Queen Empress versus Abdullah. So in this case, there was a prostitute, right? And some heated words were exchanged between the prostitute and the customer. And this customer slits the throat of the prostitute, right? This throat was slit, correct? Almost half. But prostitute did not die. She was bleeding, right? There was too much bleeding from the throat, and she was taken to the police. I mean, the police came, right? And when she was trying to speak, she was just blabbering, blood, and nothing was audible because the throat was half cut. The windpipe was cut. It was slit into half. And when she was trying to speak, nothing was coming out. However, she was trying her best and she was making her gestures. She was making her gestures to communicate who is the murderer. Correct. Now, a dying declaration which is recorded in these circumstances, you cannot say that it's an oral communication, right? So they have used the word verbal here. Verbal would include anything which is orally given, and verbal would also include something which is little bit oral, and it's the half of it is done by gestures, right? So to cover up these situations, they have used the word verbal instead of the word oral, right? So that's one thing. So they don't say oral, rather they say verbal. Verbal will include oral here, right? So that's one point. Now, second important point is that this dying declaration can be either given to the magistrate, right? This dying declaration can be given to police officer. This dying declaration even can be given to a stranger. This dying declaration can be given to a relative. Dying declaration is the last statement of a person which highlights, which shows the cause of his death or the circumstances of the transaction in which death has been caused. And it may be given to anybody, right? However, if it is given to a magistrate, the evidentiary value will be different, but it is dying declaration. Similarly, if it is given to a police officer, evidentiary value would be different, but however, it is dying declaration. Even if it is given to a stranger, it is dying declaration. Evidentiary value may vary, right? So how evidentiary value varies, that we are going to see. Now, you see, what is the best type of, okay, now the question is, can conviction happen solely on the basis of dying declaration without any further corroboration? Correct? This is the questions which bothers most of us while studying dying declaration, that can a person be convicted solely on the basis of dying declaration without there being any further corroboration of it? Can a person be convicted solely on the basis of dying declaration only, right? Now, for this, there have been so many cases. There was one case, Surendra Kumar versus State of Haryana. Judgment was given in the year 2012. Then there is a case of Paniben versus State of Gujarat, 1992 Supreme Court judgment. These two are landmark judgment, correct? So first I will go to the case, the judgment of Paniben versus State of Gujarat, right? So always remember that there is neither a rule of law nor a rule of prudence that dying declaration cannot be acted without corroboration. A dying declaration certainly can be acted upon without any corroboration. A conviction can be solely based on dying declaration. No further corroboration is required, right? A person can be convicted only and only on the basis of dying declaration, because there is no rule of law nor there is a rule of prudence which says you cannot convict a person solely on the basis of dying declaration. This is first thing you need to understand. Second important thing you need to understand is, if the court is satisfied with the truthfulness of the dying declaration, if the court is satisfied that the dying declaration has been made voluntarily, if the court is satisfied that if the court is satisfied that the person making dying declaration was under no fear or pressure, if the court is satisfied that the person making dying declaration was not hallucinating or imagining the facts, correct? If these conditions are satisfied, then we can say that the dying declaration is infusing confidence in the mind of the court. And if the dying declaration infuses enough confidence on the mind of the court, then court can convict a person solely on the basis of dying declaration, correct? Court will, however, look into these facts, that to whom dying declaration was given, right? What was the condition of the victim when he was making dying declaration? Was he feeble-minded? Was he imagining? Was he hallucinating? Or court will also look into the fact that whether the dying declaration is the result of some prompting or tutoring, correct? Court will also take this consideration into mind, right? However, if the court is satisfied that the dying declaration suffers from no infirmity, then court can solely act upon the basis of dying declaration and convict the person, correct? Now, what is the best type of dying declaration, or what are those different circumstances which will lend strength and assurance as to the reliability of dying declaration, right? What are those circumstances which will lend strength, right, and assurance as to the truthfulness of dying declaration? Correct. So first important point you must all note is that if the dying declaration was recorded by the magistrate, right, after observing due care and due precaution, if it is directly given to the magistrate, you remember confession is admissible when? What is the best quality of confessional statement? When it is recorded in terms of section 164 CRPC, right? After magistrate has ensured that, the confession is voluntarily made, right? Police has the habit of, torturing people, inducing people, threatening people, and extracting the confessions and statements. So if it is given to a police officer, court may be reluctant to act upon it in order to convict, right? If it is given to a third person, a stranger, it becomes a hearsay, right? The person who was dying told it to you and you go and tell it to court, correct? So this type of dying declaration would be a hearsay declaration, correct? So evidentiary value of hearsay is always on, it is considered as a substandard evidence. Hearsay is not a good evidence, right? If the statement is given to the person who himself is interested in the case, then also court will not solely act upon dying declaration. However, what are those circumstances which will lend some strength and truthfulness, assurance to the credibility of dying declaration? So first is, if it is written down by the magistrate with proper precautions, correct? A person gives dying declaration directly to the magistrate. Second is, if it is written down in the exact words of the victim, correct? Evidentiary value will be, the evidence will be more credible. It has to be recorded. However, there is no rule which says it has to be recorded in the exact words. Unlike confession has to be recorded in exact words, right? This is what we have seen in section 164. Before the magistrate signs the memorandum, he has to sign this also, that I have recorded the confession, in the exact words of the accused, and this confession has been read over to him and admitted to be true by him. So there is no such precaution given with section 32 subclause 1, right? However, it is good, it is preferable that it is written in the exact words of the deceased. Third important circumstance which will lend some strength to the credibility of dying declaration is that if it is written exactly after the assault, right? If it is written exactly after the assault, because if it is written, after a substantially long time, right, then facts and circumstances may be forgotten by the victim. A victim may forget facts and circumstances, correct? Or victim may start putting or adding in his own imagination to the statement. So if it is prompt, contemporary and spontaneous, it is written immediately after the assault, correct? Then this is something which will lend some strength to the credibility of dying declaration. If the victim was not under any fear or pressure while getting the statement recorded, then this is another thing which will lend some credibility to dying declaration. And similarly, one more important point, deceased must have had ample opportunities to identify the assailant, to identify the attacker, right? Because in dying declaration, if you are assaulted and then you are dying, you would like to give the name to the magistrate that yes, Mr. X assaulted. But before I could say that, right, circumstances of the assault should be such that I should have ample opportunity to identify that it was Mr. X. Correct? Then the last important point is, it is a statement, right? A statement may have, it may be a long statement. Dying declaration may be a long statement. So, deceased, when he was giving dying declaration, right, all his statements, right, the whole statement is consistent. There is consistency in the statement. Statement points in one direction. It is unidirectional. And there is no inherent consistency between statement number 1 and statement number 2. The fact number 1 he has deposed and fact number 2 which he has deposed. Correct? So if these things are fulfilled, if these circumstances are existing, then court may consider this dying declaration to be the one which is highly credible. And if the dying declaration is so credible that it infuses confidence in the mind of the court, then court can solely act upon the basis of dying declaration. Correct? So similarly, there was one more case, state of Rajasthan versus Vatiki, 2007 judgment, right? Then Panveer Savlem, Panveer Selvam, Palveer Selvam versus State of Tamil Nadu, 2009 Supreme Court. So there have been various judgments of Supreme Court in which court has repeatedly held that conviction can solely be based upon dying declaration. However, there are certain circumstances which can make dying declaration a feeble evidence, a weak evidence, right? And those circumstances may be like this, a person makes multiple dying declarations. Point is, can a person make multiple dying declarations? The answer is yes. There is no prohibition in law that dying declaration should be one. Correct? For example, declarations happens in these bride burning cases. Correct? A newly married girl, for the demand of dowry, she is burned. I mean, an attempt was made to burn her alive. However, with 80-85% burns, she survived and she was immediately rushed to the hospital. After she was rushed to the hospital, the magistrate was called because this lady wants to give the last statement, right? And she names her in-laws and her husband, right? However, she gives one statement and then retracts it thereafter and gives a second dying declaration, makes a second statement, correct? So when the victim is continuously changing the statements, or two of his statements are inconsistent, or as number of statements he or she has given, they are inconsistent with each other, then in that case, court is going to act with caution, with a great caution, and court will not convict the person solely on the basis of dying declaration, right? Court will be acting with caution, and court will not solely act upon the basis of dying declaration because the statements are inconsistent, correct? And court will call for corroboration, right? Court is not going to solely act upon the basis of dying declaration. Rather, court is going to call for further corroboration. Now, one more thing is, we all know cross-examination. What is the purpose of cross-examination? Can anyone answer?
Sir, can I?
Why do we cross-examine? What is the purpose of cross-examination?
The reason for cross-examining is to extract the truth from the accused.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Anyone else? Why do we cross-examine? What is the purpose of cross-examination?
Well, to corner the person in case he is lying, or in case he is trying to change the circumstances to his advantage and to the detriment of the other party.
Correct. Right, correct.
Thank you.
The purpose of cross-examination is to extract the truth from the statement. Correct? To filter the truth from the statement. What do courts do while taking evidence? Courts are trying to separate grain from chaff. Right? So when you got chaff, you will have to separate the grains out of it. That's what court is doing. And one mechanism to separate grain from chaff is cross-examination. A statement cannot be admitted as it is, right? You will have to subject it to cross-examination. Unless and until you subject it to cross-examination, how will you know that what is the content of truth in this statement, right? So subjecting statement to cross-examination is must. Right? Unless and until the dying declaration is such that it is of such a quality that it is infusing confidence in the mind of the court, right? Unless this is the case, court will have to be very careful while admitting the dying declaration, for the reason that dying declaration cannot be subjected to cross-examination. If a person is giving dying declaration, you cannot cross-examine him. Right, this is a very important point. So court, unless the dying declaration infuses confidence in the mind of the court should be very careful while acting upon dying declaration, because this is one such evidence on which cross-examination cannot happen. Right, dying declaration has to be recorded as it is given. Right, the person is already on the deathbed. You cannot go on to cross-examine him. Just listen to what he says and record it, believing that he is in the expectation of death and he will not be lying. This is the effect of this presumption that a man is not going to meet his maker with a lie in his mouth. The effect is that presume that whatever he is telling you is the truth and don't cross-examine him on the basis of that statement, right? This is the force of the presumption that the man is not going to meet his maker with a lie in his mouth. Whatever he is telling is the truth. Just record it as it is, right? And you cannot cross-examine the person while recording the dying declaration. Similarly, in confession, cross-examination cannot happen. I told you yesterday that there cannot be an oath administered before recording confession because oath creates the element of force. Oath creates compulsion. So you cannot administer a person the oath before his confession is recorded, correct? If the oath is administered by mistake by the magistrate before recording confession, that confession is of no use, correct? Unless, you know, the grain from chaff is separated by applying section 28 of the Evidence Act, right? The statement is of no use. Similarly, while recording dying declaration, oath cannot be administered, right? Oath cannot be administered. Now you see, the point is, another important point in dying declaration is that who has to bear the burden of proof that the dying declaration is true, and court can act solely upon the basis of dying declaration. Who has to bear this burden? This burden has to be borne by the prosecution, right? Because prosecution is interested in establishing the guilt of the person. So it is the duty of the prosecution to tell the court that, or to prove this before the court, that dying declaration is true, it is infusing enough confidence, and it can be solely acted upon, correct? It can be solely acted upon, right? Now, if you have any doubts still here, you can please unmute your mics and ask me, and then I will proceed further.
Well, not okay. No doubts, but just to verify whether we got it correctly, the first 6, am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Thank you. The first 6 circumstances that you said, which give strength and truthfulness to the credibility of dying declaration, wherein you don't need any corroboration, they by themselves are sufficient for the credibility, I mean without any corroboration to be taken. Those 6 ones do not need any corroboration, is what you meant?
Sir, what I meant to say is that when those 6 conditions are there,
right,
say that you can conclude like this, that there is credibility to dying declaration, correct? As a matter of rule, if those 6 conditions are satisfied, it's not a rule that court should consider the dying declaration to be true. However, if those conditions are satisfied, there is ample opportunity and discretion with the court to act upon dying declaration solely.
So that means even at that time, the discretion of the court is certainly not taken away.
Yes, very true.
Fair enough. And just one more thing, you gave 2, I think, landmark judgments as far as this the credible 6 situations are concerned. One was Panveer Selvam versus State of Tamil Nadu.
Yes, sir.
And the first one was State of Rajasthan versus, I'm sorry, I couldn't take that.
Sir?
Yes. The first one you said State of Rajasthan versus.
Sir, I will tell you the name.
Sure. Even at the end of the session, you know, if you can make a compilation, it doesn't matter. I mean, it won't waste your time.
Compilation of the cases, sir?
What would happen if that is the case? Then in that case, you know, compilation, if you can get it, if we can get the compilation, then I mean, it would give you more time for explanation and where time is an essence, I mean, you won't have to rush into things, is what I meant. Else we can take down.
I understand, sir. Sir, the name of that case is State of Rajasthan versus Wakteng, 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 2007. State of Rajasthan versus Wakteng, 2007. I hope you got the citation. So, yes. So,
Sorry, sir. I think you're not audible.
and one more important case, if you are noting it down, the Haryana 2012 Supreme Court.
2012 Supreme Court. Haryana, you said, right?
Haryana, yes, correct.
And what is the name of the parties? I mean, state of Haryana is fine.
State of Surendra Kumar versus State of Haryana. Surendra Kumar, SURENDRA. Surendra Kumar versus State of Haryana.
Wonderful. Surendra Kumar versus state of Haryana. And as far as the feeble circumstances are concerned, there's only one that you said was multiple dying declarations wherein there is inconsistency between the statements of the person, right?
Yes.
So that is the only one you have given so far.
I mean, no, not only one. When dying declaration is feeble, so first is statement. When the person is making the statement, he is feeble-minded. Correct? There is some brain injury or something, right? There is too much of blood loss. When there is too much of blood loss, also in that case, that situation also may lead to hallucination, feeble-mindedness. So if the person is making dying declaration out of his imaginations, which he may believe it to be true, right? That's first thing. Then second thing is that the dying declaration which is made is a hearsay statement. It's given to a stranger, and that stranger is coming before the court to make a deposition, right? It is not directly given to magistrate, or if it is given to police officer and police officer is deposing it before the court, that's also a weak type of dying declaration. Third weak type of feeble type of dying declaration is where the court is of the opinion that the dying declaration is the result of tutoring and prompting. Correct? This person is making such a statement because he was prompted to say so, right? Because he was tutored to say so, right? Similarly, if the dying declaration is made after too long a gap from assault to the making of dying declaration, there is too long a gap, then also court will view that dying declaration with some suspicion. Correct? So these are some of the circumstances, right? So how much should be the evidential value of dying declaration? That has to come from the circumstances in which dying declaration was given, the person to whom dying declaration was given, right? So any other doubt?
I have a doubt. Sir, you told that it should be based on satisfied truthfulness of the dying declaration to be considered. What if a person is before tutored, and then how will the court take into consideration the dying declaration is truthfulness?
See, court cannot rip apart a man's mind, right? Whether you are tutored or not, court cannot rip your mind apart and look for itself that whether there is prompting or tutoring in your mind. Correct? It has to be ascertained from the circumstances of the case and the surrounding facts. Are you getting this point? There is no way with the court to rip a man's mind to find the truth, right? So court will have to see that whether facts and circumstances are such that which are lending truthfulness to dying declaration. If that's not the case, then court can view the dying declaration with suspicion. Court has full liberty, right? And court can go for further corroboration instead of acting solely on the basis of dying declaration. Correct? It's see 1 minute. One more thing you must all understand is, I said that there is no thumb rule, there is no rule of law, or nor there is rule of prudence that dying declaration cannot be acted without corroboration. Correct. At the same time, I must also tell you, even if dying declaration infuses too much confidence in the mind of the court, there is nothing which prevents the court from seeking further corroboration. Correct. And I must also tell you that court, as a matter of routine, also should not start convicting people on the basis of dying declaration, because that would also be a dangerous situation. That as a matter of routine, courts are, convicting people simply on the basis of dying declaration. That's also not permissible. Not permissible in the sense, not permissible by the, implications. It's not that it is expressly prohibited, but that's something which is not intended by section 32, that you should, because it is only one relevant fact amongst many others. And always remember, when we study relevancy, all relevant facts must be proved. Just because a fact is relevant, it does not become conclusive evidence of the, it does not become conclusive evidence of anything. It is just relevant. The evidence of it can be given before the court. That does not become conclusive evidence. So always write it somewhere that all relevant facts must be proved before the court. Right now, they are only relevant. Right? They are only relevant, and thus they may be admissible, because I told you the difference between relevancy and admissibility. Not every relevant fact will be admissible. Relevancy is a matter of logic. Admissibility is a matter of law and policy. Right? There are many relevant facts. We have seen yesterday confession. Confession is very relevant. But then admissibility says if it is given to a police officer, not admissible. Right? Privileged communication between husband and wife. A husband may give very important information to wife that yes, today I had killed 3 people. Wife cannot go and give the evidence of the same before the court. So it is relevant. A man saying I have killed 3 men, but not admissible, right? Because admissibility is a matter of policy. Admissibility is a matter of law, right? So any other doubt you have so far, you can unmute your mic and ask me. Otherwise, we'll go ahead.
Sir, I have a follow-up question. Regarding the multiple FIRs, which is the which FIR, like for example, A has 2 FIRs, which are multiple declarations. Which declaration is considered to be valid before the court and admitted?
See, I must tell you one thing, that FIR can also be a dying declaration. Correct? A person was assaulted. He immediately after the assault rushed to the court. He's bleeding. He's injured. And he immediately rushes to the police station and gives a statement, lodges an FIR, and he dies. Right? Now, in that case, the statements mentioned in the FIR will be treated as his dying declaration. FIR can also amount to dying declaration. Correct? If the victim dies after giving the statement, FIR becomes dying declaration. If so far as it relates to the cause of his death or the circumstances of the transaction in which death has been caused. So that's one thing. Second, what I have understood from your question is you are asking me about multiple FIRs, right? For example, about the same incident, Harshita went to police station and got the FIR lodged. Thereafter, Prashant went to police station and he wants to get another FIR lodged. After that, Jitendra went to the courtroom, police station, and he wants to get the 3rd FIR lodged. So out of these 3 FIRs, which one, which FIR should be actually lodged? Correct. So see, general rule is recording of the FIR will not be prohibited. If you want to get 3 FIRs recorded, 3 FIRs will be lodged because all of them are coming from different persons. Or what police officers, CRPC is silent upon the question of multiple FIRs. However, police officer can also take into consideration the FIR which gives most exhaustive details of the incidents. Correct? Which FIR can be the basis of investigation? The one which gives most exhaustive basis of the incident, most exhaustive details of the incidents. That FIR can be the basis of investigation of the police, right? So if this is done, we will go on to, next important section of relevancy. Okay, one last important point I must tell you. What is the proof of dying declaration? I mean, how a dying declaration must be proved. What is the method of proving a dying declaration, right? Since you cannot subject it to cross-examination, so what is the method of proving the dying declaration? So always remember that the only method of proving the dying declaration is to examine the person, right, who has recorded it. Correct. So if dying declaration is given to a police officer, magistrate can go on to examine that police officer. If the dying declaration is given to a stranger, that stranger can be called before the court and he can be examined by the court as to what disease, has said to him, who all were the persons there present when the diseased person was making the statement. So these things, on these lines, court can certainly go on to examine the person who comes before the court, with a dying declaration with him. Right?
Just one question on this, Mr. Harsh. You said to examine the person who has recorded the statement, be it a stranger, be it the police officer, whoever. Now, here, does the term examination also include cross-examination of the person?
Sir, yes. When the police officer, let's say, is taking the dying declaration to the court, correct? It is cross-examination of the police officer only to see whether he was actually present there or not, whether he ever met the victim or not. Correct? A police officer may be lying as to the circumstances, right? It is not the question of cross-examining the statement which is purported as dying declaration, right? However, to ascertain whether this police officer was actually there or not, whether there was somebody else, when the dying declaration was made, or was he the only person standing in the room, correct? So on these aspects, the police officer can be examined. However, the dying declaration which he is giving to the court will be taken as it is, right? Because, sir, you see, cross-examination is of whom? Cross-examination is of the person who gives examination in chief ordinarily, right? So once you are examined in chief, subsequently you will be cross-examined on the basis of the statement you have made in your examination in chief. Now here the person, so I am just drawing an analogy to explain. The person who has given dying declaration, let's take him as a person who has given his examination in chief. This is just an analogy. The person who has given examination in chief, when he himself is dead, then how can you cross-examine him on the basis of the statement he has given in examination in chief? You cannot cross-examine. There is no opportunity. This is what is section 32, right? Section 32 says a statement is given by a person who is either dead or who cannot be found, or who cannot be called to the court, or who has become an incompetent witness, right? So these people are not available. So whatever statement a police officer brings as dying declaration, that will be taken as it is. There is no cross-examination as to that, because the maker of the statement is dead. If you had to cross-examine, you can cross-examine only the maker of the statement. Now maker of the statement is no more, right? So there is absolutely no point in cross-examining the police officer on that statement. The statement will be taken as it is. However, court will examine the person who brings dying declaration with respect to other incidental and allied facts, right? That whether he was actually there, what was the time when this dying declaration was given, right? After how much time the person died after having made a declaration, right? I hope, sir, this answers your question.
Yes, in short, to cut a long story short, it is the analogically, it is the cross-examination of the recorder to check the veracity of whether he is telling the truth or not the statement of the dead.
Not the statement of the dead, correct?
Right?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Very clear. Excellent. Thank you.
So with this, we will go on to next section of relevancy. If there is any doubt so far, you can just put it in the chat box. I can take it up at the end. So can you go to Harshita, section 11 of the Evidence Act? So as I had already told you that, during the 4 days program, the whole relevancy cannot be taught. So first I will take up most important provisions. So in that sequence, I'll take up another important provision of the another important provision of the Evidence Act, which is section 11, right? Now, this section has to be read with lot of caution, right? This section has to be read with lot of caution, because this is such a powerful section which, if not interpreted and understood properly, can subsume the whole concept of relevancy in itself, right? Look at the power of the statement, the opening words of this section. Section says, facts not otherwise relevant are relevant. Can you imagine the scope which these words, opening words, can give to section 11, right? Such a powerful provision. It says something which is not relevant, it can become relevant. That means even irrelevant facts are becoming or are capable of becoming relevant under section 11. Correct? So there are two cautions I would like to give you before I proceed with section 11, right? Remember that relevancy is contained between section 6 to section 55, right? I told you what is relevancy. Relevancy is nothing but when one fact has got logical connection with fact in issue or other facts, it is called a relevant fact. Now those logical connections are provided in section 6 to section 55. Dying declaration we have just now seen is a logical fact. It has got a logical connection with death because statement relates to the cause of his death. Motive, preparation, conduct, occasion, cause, effect are relevant under section 7 and section 8 respectively. Res geste is relevant in section 6. So each of these section is telling us about the logical connection, right, which a fact may have with fact in issue, right? Now you remember that all these sections starting from section 6 to section 55, they are not exclusive in their domains. They are not exclusive in their domains and they are overlapping with each other, right? They are overlapping with each other. Section 6 is not exclusive from section 7. Section 7 is not exclusive from section 8. They are overlapping, right? Similarly, there is an overlap between section 32 and section 7. Correct? For example, section 7 talks about, facts which are occasion, cause, effect, opportunity of fact and issue, right? So I had already told you that cause and effect, what is the cause of the crime, is relevant in section 7. Section 8 says motive, preparation and conduct, right? Now you see motive is also psychological cause. Section 7 already has spoken about cause. So if there is no section 7, then motive, preparation and conduct could have been covered under section 7 itself, under the guise of these words, occasion, cause and effect. Conduct, a person running away after killing somebody, correct? He is running away, that's his conduct. But is conduct or can't conduct be made relevant under section 7 also? Because section 7 makes cause and effect relevant. A person runs away after committing the crime, after committing the murder. A thief would run away. That's the effect and effect of committing a crime, and effect is already relevant under section 7. Res geste, facts forming part of same transaction, this could also have been relevant under section 7. So similarly, section 32 says when the statement of a dead person relates to the cause of his death, right? Now this cause is already covered under section 7. Even if you delete section 32 subclause 1, you can make dying declaration relevant under section 7 also. Correct? So what I'm trying to tell you is that how do we study relevancy when there is so much of overlap? So the rule is, if a fact is distinctly made relevant under a particular section, then it has the relevancy of that fact has to be understood in the ambit of that section itself. You are not going to read it by implication. You are not going to read the relevancy by implication in some other section. That means motive, although it is a psychological cause is already covered in section 7, but there is a specific section 8 which is dedicated for motive. So the relevancy of motive has to be read under section 8 only. You cannot read it by implication in section 7. Correct? Similarly, section 11, it says facts not otherwise relevant will become relevant. Correct? That means if you delete all the provisions of relevancy and just retain section 11 is sufficient, because section 11 says something is not relevant can be relevant. That means it is obvious that all relevant things will certainly be relevant. You remove all the sections of relevancy, section 11 will still serve the purpose. However, the rule of reading section 11 is when there are different sections dealing with different type of relevant facts, then those facts would be relevant under those respective sections only. Just because section 11 says irrelevant facts are also relevant, you are not going to bring each and everything on earth under the ambit of section 11. Correct? If you want to read some further deliberations on this, you can refer to 69th Law Commission report, right? So you would better appreciate the point which I'm trying to tell you right now. Now you see, facts which are not otherwise relevant will become relevant when, point number 1, if they are inconsistent with any fact and issue or relevant fact. That means if there is a fact and issue, this is fact number 1, and there is a fact number 2, and both facts are inconsistent with each other. Inconsistent with each other mean what? Look at section 11 subclause 1. It uses the word inconsistent. Inconsistent means what? What is the meaning of this word inconsistent? Inconsistent here means they cannot exist together. Inconsistent means what? Two facts cannot exist together. Either fact and issue can exist or this relevant fact can exist. If this is possible, then this is not possible. If this is possible, then this is not going to happen. Correct? If two facts are so inconsistent with each other, that they cannot exist together at the same time, either fact number 1 can exist and fact number 2 cannot exist, or fact number 2, if it exists, fact number 1 cannot exist. If the inconsistency is such, then such inconsistent facts are relevant. Correct? And here, what is popularly known as plea of alibi, right? Alibi or alibi, right? Becomes relevant, right? Now, police accuses me in the FIR for having committed a murder in Bangalore on 1st January 2020. They accuse me of having committed a murder in Bangalore on 1st January 2020. This is the FIR lodged against me, right? And I am saying that on this date when this murder has happened, of which you are alleging me, on 1st January 2020, I was present in Delhi. I was not even in Bangalore. Right? Now you see here we have two facts. Me having committed a murder on 1st January 2020 in Bangalore. Right? This is fact and issue. Right? Fact and issue is what? Whether Mr. Harsh has committed murder on so and so date at such and such place intentionally. This is fact and issue. Another fact I am giving you is that I was present in Delhi on 1st January 2020. So there are two facts. Me having committed a murder on this day in Bangalore and me being present in Delhi. Can these two facts exist together? Answer is no. Either I could have committed murder in Bangalore or I could have been in Delhi. But these two facts cannot exist together at the same time. I hope you are getting the point. These two facts cannot exist together at the same time. Either I can be in Delhi or I could be in Bangalore committing the murder. So if I give certain proof to establish my presence in Delhi, for example, I gave the flight ticket, I submitted the flight ticket in evidence, right? That I traveled to Delhi on 31st December itself. I had left for Delhi on 31st and this is the flight ticket. Correct? Then I could give some parking tickets which I had obtained in Delhi. PVR mall I visited, right? Video recording at the entrance of the shopping mall is there. I went to cinema theater, cinema hall, the ticket is there. So if somehow I can, I had a hotel reservation in Delhi. I had met few clients in Delhi that day. So if I can bring cogent evidences, right, of my presence in Delhi, then fact in issue goes down, it backs off. It cannot exist with all these facts which establish my presence in Delhi. Correct? So you understand why inconsistency, why irrelevancy is also irrelevant. Irrelevancy is also relevant in law and section 11 is the manifestation of it. Correct? Irrelevancy also becomes relevant. right? So law does not only deal with relevancy, it is dealing with irrelevancy of certain things. They are so irrelevant that they become inconsistent. Two facts are not existing together, right? One more example I can give you. Apart from plea of alibi, students think that section 11 is nothing but plea of alibi. Section 11 actually can be put to variety of uses, right? For example, uh, Harshita alleges that, I have written a defamatory letter to her, correct? She goes to the court, right? Files a complaint, 499 IPC defamation, that, Mr. Harsh has written a defamatory letter to me, right? I went before the court and deposed that how can I write a letter? I am completely illiterate. Neither I can read nor I can write. Correct? So there are two facts here. Me writing a defamatory letter to Harshita, and second fact is me being an illiterate man who can neither read nor write. Right? And if I am illiterate, then fact number one, that me having written a letter cannot exist. If I have written a letter, then I cannot be illiterate. Me being illiterate and me writing a letter, these two facts, can they exist together? They cannot exist together. Either I can be illiterate or I can be writing letter. I cannot be illiterate and writing letter at the same time. Either I can be in Bangalore or I can be in Delhi. I cannot be both in Bangalore and Delhi at the same time. I hope you are getting my points, right? Third situation I can give you is, the deceased was a tall man. He was a giant, tall man of 6 feet 8 inches height, correct? And he is stabbed with a screwdriver in the neck, right? A perfect incision right through the neck. A screwdriver has been thrusted in the neck. The person who is accused of having committed this, Mr. A, is a dwarf. Dwarf, you understand? Right? Those who cannot grow beyond a height, short-heighted people. So he is just 4 feet. Correct? Or 4.5. And the person who is stabbed was giant 6.5 or 6.8. Is it possible for a man of 4.5 feet or 4 feet to deliver such a precise incision with a screwdriver, that too with a screwdriver in somebody's neck? Is it possible? Prashant, you can say that if not possible, then probable. If not impossible, then at least probable, right? So you will have to refer to clause 2, correct? There are certain facts which can render the existence of fact in issue either highly probable or highly improbable, right? If it is highly improbable, if one fact renders the fact in issue highly probable, then also that fact is relevant. If one fact renders the fact in issue highly improbable, then also the fact is relevant. Correct? You see, there was this movie, if you have seen American Sniper. American Sniper, it's one of my favorite movies. You can watch it. So American Sniper, is about a sniper from America who was posted in Taliban, right? The name of the sniper is Chris Kyle. You can, search him on Google, Chris Kyle. So he was one of the best American sniper which, American forces have ever had. And when this Chris Kyle is guarding the roofs, American forces moving on the ground used to consider themselves as invincible. This was the kind of, reputation Chris Kyle has, that from the rooftops he will eliminate all the threats and American forces can move on the ground smoothly. And there was a Talibani sniper, right, who used to kill American soldiers, and he was also taking long range shots. once it so happened that this Talibani sniper was taking aim at American forces. He was shooting at American forces from a distance of 1.6 miles, 1.6 to 1.7. It was a huge distance. And this Mr. Chris Kyle traced him, logged him from his telescope, which is mounted on Chris Kyle's rifle. This American sniper, he could spot the Talibani sniper. And he took a aim on him. This shot was to go approximately 1.6 miles. That means, you can take it an estimation of 3 kilometers, approximately 3 kilometers. This man had to take a shot, right? And he locked the aim and he pulled the trigger. Bullet traveled 3 miles, right? And it goes on to hit in the forehead of this Talibani sniper from 3 miles, approximately 3 kilometers, 1.6 miles, right? And this Talibani sniper was dead from a shot which was taken from 3 miles. And it was the highest recorded, sniper kill during those days. Nobody has taken a headshot from such a distance. Then when these facts were submitted to the American government defense ministry, they had to verify and put this on record that Chris Kyle took the shot. So a committee of experts was called and it was asked to examine whether it is probable for a man to take a headshot from 3 kilometers using this particular weapon. So that expert team examined the gun which Chris Kyle was using. Expert team also examined the kind of experience this Chris Kyle had, right? The kind of history he had of taking long shots. American team also examined the weather conditions which were existing that day. What was the wind speed? What was the visibility? What was the time? Because time determines the visibility. How clear the weather is determines the visibility. Correct? And after examination, they came to a conclusion, right? Now, when I say the conclusion, focus on the last line of subclause 2, right? I will read subclause 2. It says, if by themselves, what by themselves? Facts by themselves, right? Or in connection with other facts, make the existence or non-existence of a fact an issue or relevant fact highly probable or highly improbable, right? So what American government, defense experts concluded? Defense experts concluded that a shot from 3 miles, a headshot from 3 miles, correct, is highly probable, right? Considering the weapon he was using, considering the climatic conditions that day, and considering the skills he has got. They said it is highly probable that a man could take this shot. It is not improbable, it is probable. Correct? So if there are certain facts, all of them are pointing in one direction, all of them are pointing in the direction of probability that yes, it is probable that Prashant could have killed, right? Then all those facts which are pointing in Prashant's direction that it is probable that he's the killer, all such facts are relevant facts. Or if there are certain set of facts, right, which are suggesting that no, it is highly improbable that Prashant could have killed, it is improbable, then all those set of facts which are rendering it improbable that Mr. A or let's say Mr. Prashant could have killed, all those facts are relevant facts. Correct? All those facts are relevant facts. Now let's say if there is a situation like this, can you go to illustration number B? Illustration number B. You see, this provides for an interesting situation, correct? And the situation is like this, that only 4 persons had the opportunity to kill Mr. X, right? Only 4 persons had the opportunity to kill Mr. X, Because let's say I will improvise this illustration number B and tell you. Let's say Mr. X was killed at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? And only A, B, C, and D, right? They were the one present in the house with Mr. X. So it is clear that only A, B, C, D had the opportunity to kill X, right? So the crime could have been committed only by either A or B or C or D. Now, further investigation revealed that B, C, and D have not committed the crime. It is highly probable that A is the one who has committed the crime. Correct? So, this fact that B, C, and D, there are no evidences against them, and crime could have been committed by only A, B, C, and D is a relevant fact because it renders it highly probable that A is the killer. Right? Crime could have been committed by either me and you. And if you have not committed, then who probably has done it? Remaining is me. That's the same situation here. Right? So, if there is any doubt so far, you can please unmute the mics and ask me.
I think there's a question in the chat box by Prashant, sir.
I think Harshita, Mr. Harsh has already answered that question. The question is already answered by him.
Sir, I have a question. You told that illustration B, there is high probability of A getting committed to the murder in spite of A, B, C, D. So then, what if there is contribution of B, C, D also in the relevant crime? How will the probability be proven before the court?
Right. Don't assume some facts. I have told the facts very clearly that there is potent evidence that B, C, and D have not committed X. Correct. There is a potent evidence that B, C, and D have not committed. So the only person would have committed this mistake.
I think there's some sound issues, network issues with this, so you're not audible.
Am I audible?
No, sir, not yet. No, sir, not yet. I think you can reconnect.
Am I audible now?
Very much audible, sir.
So here we complete section 11 also, and I am open to conducting few more lectures in the upcoming days because a lot of things in the relevancy is still pending. I mean, to my understanding, there are two important topics relevancy of judgments and expert opinion. These two topics are pending, and I cannot start these topics now and finish them today itself. Each of these topics will require 1.5 hour session each, and that too when I hurry up the things. So I hope remaining sections on admissibility, if the participants wish, I can spare some time some other day and complete them. So that's my idea of the thing. And 1.5 hour, it's a very short time to deal with the important deal with the whole relevancy. Relevancy is a big thing in itself. If you read Evidence Act, if you refer to commentaries on Evidence Act, you will find that 70% of the evidence actually comprises of relevancy, and everything put together is just 30% of it, right? So I can give you with few quick readings on Evidence Act. If you want to command Evidence Act, then please read 69th Law Commission report, right? I will leave you with few quick readings on Evidence Act. So 69th Law Commission report, if you really want to command the subject, and if you want to take your understanding even beyond that, then please refer this book, Stephen's Digest on Evidence and Wigmore on Evidence. Correct? Wigmore on Evidence, kindly refer them. As a students, if you are using something for your class preparation, or for if you want a textbook, then you can refer to a book by Justice Munir on Evidence Act. That's a really good book. So these things you can refer, and always remember, relevancy is something, all sections starting from section 5 to 55, most of the sections are principles of relevancy. Correct? So unless and until you read them again and again, they won't stick in your brain. Right? Whenever you read IPC, it is very easy to imagine IPC. It is very easy to imagine CRPC. It is easy to imagine, CPC. But evidence, what remains in your mind? Nothing remains, because each of these sections are principles in themselves. Correct? So since you can't imagine it, these are principles, abstract principles, which you will have to understand by, reading them again and again. It becomes little difficult at times to, appreciate the subject of evidence. If I tell you about something about FIR, something about charge sheet, something about confession, it really retains in your mind, because you can imagine a courtroom, you can imagine a police officer, you can imagine him writing an FIR. But relevancy is nothing but it is a set of principles. So if you want to command the courtrooms, then you should have thorough understanding of what relevancy is, because Evidence Act is equally applicable to both civil proceedings and criminal proceedings. There cannot be a practice without, commanding law of evidence. One more important thing I must tell you is, it is such a powerful subject that has called for minimum number of amendments, drafted way back in 1872. And absolutely there has been no requirement to amend Evidence Act. The only requirement was felt after, electronic communications, electronic evidence came in place. So wherever it has been amended only to incorporate, electronic communications and electronic records as evidence. Otherwise, absolutely there was no need. It is such a fantastic piece of work, such a small legislation, such small sections, but then it governs such big procedures like CPC and CRPC. Professor D.D. Vasu has written a commentary on Evidence Act, and Professor D.D. Vasu quotes it in his commentary. And he says that when Evidence Act came for the review before the members of Law Commission, they had put it on record that if we want to suggest changes, if we want to revise the sections of Indian Evidence Act and yet retain its core, we are highly incompetent to do that. To do such a tremendous job, somebody like Sir James Stephen would have to, come on this earth again and has to himself take up this task. Otherwise, we cannot review it, we cannot amend it, and yet remain the core of the subject. If we mess up with the Evidence Act, if we try to review the Evidence Act, it would be actually a mess up. So somebody with the mettle and competency of Sir James Stephen has to come again on earth and has to do this work. So with these remarks,
just one thing, Harsh ji. Sir Stephen when he made this act, promulgated it in the 19th century,
Yes, sir.
has taken cognizance of the prostitute's case in the 17th century and differentiated between oral and verbal.
Yes, correct, sir.
Who do you think would have the metal to change that thing? Although it is 167 sections, but then it is like Bhagavad Gita, you can say that. I mean,
It is indeed, sir.
that is point one, and point number two is, I mean, besides practicing as an advocate, I have also been into teaching law. I think, thank you. I think one of the best teachers I have seen so far, I can name it to you, as far as evidence goes, because I mean, flattery or exaggeration aside, totally, but then understanding the core of evidence, as you said, is like well begun is half done. If 70% you can understand the relevancy of facts from 5 to 55, remaining 30% is for students like us, sir. Fantastic, excellent presentation, and we certainly would look forward to the other topic that you said, which perhaps a lecture or two you would like to engage 1.5 hours each. Harshita, please let us know as and when he is engaging the lectures.
Sure, sir, will be informed. As soon as
My only constraint was in terms of time, sir. Such a big thing cannot be dealt within 4 lectures, 1.5 hours each. Otherwise, I would have had more opportunity to, deliberate further on each of these topics. But, I thank you so much for being there throughout the sessions, and thank you so much for the words of encouragement, sir.
That shows the integrity of yours. Let us be very honest, and I think each and every person would agree. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the session. I, Harshita Khare, on the behalf of Law Internship, extend a hearty gratitude to Mr. Harsh Pratap Singh sir, who honored us with an enriching session and took out time of his busy schedule. I must also mention a deep sense of appreciation to all the participants who were present today. I hope this session had a great learning experience to all of you. Thank you again, one and all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, organizers, for this opportunity. Thank you so much for the words of encouragement, Raju sir. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.